The insistent vibration of my phone dragged me from the quiet order of my lab. I ignored it, focused on the delicate curvature of a fifth metatarsal. The bone, part of an ongoing cold case, whispered stories of a life lived hard, a life ended violently. But the vibration persisted, a relentless drone against the sterile silence. I sighed, pulling off my nitrile gloves. When the caller ID displayed Emergency Services Dispatch, I knew my morning was about to unravel. "Chen," I answered, my voice still laced with the quiet intensity of my work. "Dr. Chen, we have a situation," a male voice, crisp and urgent, replied. "Construction excavation off Elm and 14th. They hit something. Looks like multiple remains. We need you out here. ASAP." I didn't need to ask for details. On my way. The drive to the site was a blur of city traffic, the usual urban cacophony amplified by the urgency thrumming in my veins. My mind was already piecing together possibilities, drawing on years of experience unearthing the forgotten. Multiple remains. Shallow grave. Construction site. When I arrived, the scene was chaos distilled. Yellow tape fluttered in the brisk autumn wind, sectioning off a raw, gaping wound in the earth. A dozen uniformed officers moved with a practiced, somber efficiency, holding back a small cluster of curious onlookers and a bewildered construction crew. The air hung thick with the scent of disturbed soil, diesel, and something else, a faint, metallic tang I knew intimately. A detective, a tall man with a perpetually tired expression and eyes that had seen too much, met me at the perimeter. "Dr. Chen. Thanks for coming so quickly. What have we got?" I asked, my gaze already sweeping past him to the excavation pit. "It's a lot," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. The excavator operator thought he hit a tree root. Turned out to be something much worse. I stepped over the tape, my boots sinking slightly into the churned earth. The pit was roughly 15 feet deep, a jagged scar in the urban landscape. Even from this distance, I could discern the unmistakable ivory gleam of bone against the rich brown earth. Not just one, but several. As I descended into the pit, the full horror of the discovery solidified. The grave was less a grave and more a hastily covered pit, barely 4 feet deep. The remains were commingled, tangled together in a macabre tableau. I knelt, pulling a small trowel and brush from my kit. The raw smell of earth intensified, mingled now with the faint, sweet decay of time. "Looks like at least 3 individuals," I murmured, more to myself than to the detective who had followed me down. My eyes scanned the exposed bones, noting the general disarticulation, the relatively poor state of preservation consistent with a shallow, unprotected burial. The soil, a heavy clay, had done its best, but moisture and root intrusion had taken their toll. I began my initial assessment, my movements slow and deliberate, each stroke of the brush revealing more of the grim puzzle. The bones were discolored, stained by the earth, but the fundamental architecture was there. Pelvises, femurs, cranial fragments. I could discern differences in size and robusticity, suggesting a mix of sexes, possibly ages. The sheer volume of skeletal material was staggering. What struck me immediately wasn't just the number, but the arrangement. Or rather, the lack of it. They weren't laid out with any reverence. It was as if they had been unceremoniously dumped, one on top of the other, limbs askew. Yet, there was a peculiar underlying pattern, a subtle geometry in their disarray that pricked at my forensic intuition. It wasn't entirely random. My gaze sharpened, moving from the general to the specific. I spotted it first on a fragmented cranium, a distinct, linear depression, consistent with perimortem trauma. Not just one. As I carefully cleared more soil, I saw similar patterns on other bones, sharp force indentations on ribs, blunt force fractures on a tibia. These weren't accidents of excavation. These were Injuries sustained around the time of death, evidence of violence. And the consistency of the trauma across the different individuals was profoundly disturbing. It spoke of a repeated action, a deliberate, almost ritualistic application of force. "These aren't recent," I stated, my voice low. The bone degradation, the soil staining, the way the roots had intertwined with the skeletal elements, it all pointed to decades. Not years. And they didn't die peacefully. The detective grunted, his face grim. "Any idea how many exactly?" "At least 3 complete individuals." "Possibly more based on the commingling," I replied, carefully brushing away soil from a small hand bone. "But until we get them out, it's difficult to say for certain. The way they're layered, it suggests a single event, or at least a very short period between deaths and burial." The scale of the problem began to loom. This wasn't a single, isolated incident. The manner of burial, the distinct patterns of perimortem trauma, it was too organized, too deliberate for a simple, desperate act. And if this was one such burial, how many more lay hidden beneath the city's concrete skin? I looked around the excavation pit, the disturbed earth, the indifferent city skyline towering above us. The remains stared back, silent witnesses to an ancient wrong. My work had just begun. My team and I would have to meticulously recover every fragment, every shard, then transport them to the University Medical School cadaver storage facility for the painstaking work of reconstruction and identification. The secrets they held would demand every ounce of my determination. Here, the air hummed with the low thrum of ventilation systems, carrying the faint, clean scent of antiseptic and something deeper, something organic, perpetually present despite the rigorous cleaning protocols. My workspace was a gleaming stainless steel table, large enough to accommodate the long bones of an adult, flanked by smaller trays holding an array of calipers, probes, and brushes. Overhead, powerful LED lights cast a shadowless, unforgiving glare on everything. This was my domain, where the dead truly began to speak, away from the clamor and dust of the living world. The first set of remains, carefully transported in a body bag marked Subject A, lay before me. I'd insisted on supervising the transfer personally, each bone a fragile testament. My gloved hands, steady and accustomed to the macabre, began the meticulous process of reconstruction. Cranial fragments were pieced together like an ancient jigsaw puzzle, the sutures locking with satisfying precision. The bone, though degraded by decades in the earth, still held its secrets. "Let's start with the basics, people," I instructed, my voice cutting through the quiet hum. My 2 assistants, a quiet graduate student and a more seasoned forensic technician, moved with practiced efficiency around the adjacent tables. Radiographs first. Full set. Then photo documentation, every angle, every fragment. I focused on Subject A's skull. The robust brow ridge and pronounced mastoid process pointed to a male individual. Examining the auricular surface of the pelvis, I estimated an age range of late 20s to early 30s. The pubic symphysis, though weathered, showed the characteristic changes. "Male, approximately 28 to 32 years old," I murmured, making a note on my digital pad. Ancestry indicators point towards a broad European background, but will need genetic analysis to confirm. My attention then shifted to the perimortem trauma. The left temporal bone displayed a depressed fracture, roughly circular, about an inch in diameter. Radiating lines spiderwebbed outwards, clear evidence of blunt force applied just prior to or at the time of death. The edges of the fracture showed no signs of healing, consistent with my initial field assessment. "Impact site, left temple," I dictated, leaning closer, a magnifying glass held to my eye. "Consistent with a blunt instrument. Look at the internal beveling, indicates force directed inwards. This was a lethal blow." As I continued, my mind began to connect the dots, drawing on the patterns I'd observed at the excavation. Subject B, also male, presented with similar cranial trauma, though on the right parietal. Subject C, a more gracile skeleton I tentatively identified as female, displayed a smaller, but equally devastating, impact to the occipital bone. The consistency was unnerving. Not just blunt force, but blunt force delivered with a specific intent and, it seemed, a preferred methodology. Raj, the forensic technician, called out, her voice low. Subject D, look at this. I walked over to her table. Subject D, another male, lay partially articulated. His left ulna and radius, the bones of the forearm, showed multiple transverse fractures. Not the clean breaks of a fall, but jagged, segmented lines. Defensive wounds, I stated, the words tasting bitter. He raised his arm to block a blow. And here, she continued, pointing to the anterior surface of the tibia. A small, shallow notch was visible, almost like a scrape, but with sharp, clean edges. Unusual, isn't it? Or a specific type of impact? I knelt, bringing my eye level with the bone. The mark was indeed peculiar. It wasn't a fracture, nor a typical cut. It was a precise gouge, almost a signature. I moved back to Subject A, then B, then C. On Subject A, I found a similar, though fainter, mark on the right fibula. Subject B had one on a rib, near the sternum. Subject C, on the left patella. My internal thoughts raced. This wasn't random. This wasn't a frenzied attack. This was a deliberate, consistent pattern. The blunt force trauma, almost always to the head, suggesting a rapid incapacitation or execution. They weren't fatal, but they were present. On every single set of remains. These marks, I said, my voice gaining an edge, are not accidental. They're too similar, too consistently placed on different parts of the body, yet always present. This isn't just a killer, this is someone with a methodology. We had found our first real clue, something beyond the obvious violence. This was the killer's fingerprint, etched into bone. It spoke of control, of repeated acts, of a mind that perhaps saw its victims not as individuals, but as canvases for a grim, personal statement. This wasn't just multiple victims, it was a series of carefully orchestrated deaths, each bearing the same unsettling mark. The bones had indeed begun to speak, and their story was far more organized, far more sinister, than I had initially dared to imagine. The hum of the refrigeration units, usually a background drone I barely noticed, now vibrated through the floor, a low thrum against my ribs. I stood over the articulated skeleton, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished bone. My gaze drifted to the specific marks I'd identified just hours before, the minute, almost surgical incisions on the ribs, the precise fracture patterns on the distal phalanges, and the distinct, shallow grooves etched into the occipital bone. These weren't random acts of violence. This was a signature. It's a process, I murmured, more to myself than to the colleague who stood a respectful distance away, observing my focus. The first subject showed it, but I needed to be certain. Now, with the second, it's undeniable. My colleague, a younger forensic anthropologist, adjusted his glasses. The perimortem trauma is consistent, Raj. And the tool marks. They suggest a specific kind of blade, almost like a specialized instrument, not just a common knife. I nodded, tracing a gloved finger along a hairline fracture on a vertebral body. More than that. Look at the positioning of these injuries. They're not defensive. They're deliberate. And the sequence. The individual was restrained, or incapacitated, before the final acts. The detective had arrived shortly after, his face etched with a familiar blend of fatigue and grim determination. I laid out my findings on a metal tray, using magnified photographs and anatomical diagrams. These aren't isolated incidents, detective. The perpetrator is methodical. The burial patterns, shallow, unmarked, specific orientation, they're replicated. And the injuries, the precise nature of the trauma, the apparent use of specialized tools. This isn't random. It's ritualistic, in its own twisted way. The detective's jaw tightened as he studied the images. So, what are we looking at, Raj? A single individual? Or something more organized? The precision points to a single, highly organized individual, or a small, coordinated group working with identical methods, I explained, gesturing to the minute striations on a rib fragment. The consistency across multiple individuals, even with varying skeletal robusticity, is remarkable. It speaks of practice, of refinement. And the fact that they're all found in shallow, unmarked graves, with similar decomposition patterns suggesting similar timeframes post-mortem, strengthens the argument for a repeated, systematic approach. He leaned closer, his eyes scanning the detailed report I'd prepared. You mentioned specific tools. Can you narrow it down? Not yet to a brand, but certainly to a type, I clarified. A blade with a serrated edge, but with very fine teeth, almost microscopic. And something blunt, heavy, used with controlled force to create these specific crush injuries without shattering the surrounding bone. It's like they knew exactly how much force to apply, and where. The detective straightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. This changes things. A lot. He pulled out his communication device, speaking in low, urgent tones to an unknown recipient. We need to cross-reference every cold case disappearance in the city, going back. How far, Raj? I considered the bone density, the stages of ossification, the degree of weathering. Given the state of preservation, the environment they were recovered from, I'd say we're looking at a span of at least 2 decades, possibly 3. The older remains show greater taphonomic alteration, but the perimortem indicators remain consistent. 2 decades, the detective repeated, his voice flat. Right. Focus on individuals who vanished without a trace, especially those from vulnerable populations. The detectives' team, spurred by my findings, began to connect the dots. A pattern emerged, not just in the method of disposal, but in the profiles of the missing. Young adults, often transient, or with limited social connections, who had simply vanished. Each new file confirmed the grim consistency of the perpetrator's selection criteria. Then came the call. My communication device vibrated, the detective's voice urgent, strained. Raj, we've got another one. Or rather, more. My breath hitched. Where? A construction site, about 20 kilometers north of the first discovery. They were clearing land for a new commercial park. The excavation team hit something. Soft. Just like the first time. They found a single set of remains initially, but the initial assessment points to the same shallow burial, same soil conditions. I grabbed my field kit, the familiar weight of it a small comfort. I'm on my way. The new site was a stark contrast to the previous one. Here, the earth was raw, churned by heavy machinery. A vast expanse of red-brown soil stretched under an overcast sky, the air thick with the smell of diesel and damp earth. A section had been cordoned off, marked by yellow tape fluttering in the wind. Uniformed officers moved with a subdued efficiency, their faces grim. As I approached the newly excavated trench, the lead investigator, a forensic technician I knew by reputation, met me. Dr. Chen. We tried to keep it intact as much as possible, but the machinery did some damage before we realized what we had. I descended into the shallow pit, the ground still soft from a recent rain. My eyes immediately went to the exposed bone. There it was again. The telltale position, the shallow depth, the distinct lack of any personal effects. But it wasn't just one. As the soil was carefully brushed away, another skull emerged, then another. The forensic technician pointed with a gloved hand. So far, 3 complete sets, closely clustered. And indications of more beneath them. This isn't just a grave, Raj. It's a burial ground. My gaze swept across the newly exposed bone, each fragment a silent scream. The precise, almost ritualistic nature of the previous burials had suggested a meticulous, singular hand. But now, with multiple new subjects laid out in such proximity, the scope of the horror expanded exponentially. This was no longer a single, isolated horror. My breath hitched, the cool air biting at my exposed skin. The initial burial, with its deliberate placement and careful orientation, had hinted at a singular, almost ritualistic purpose. Now, the earth had yielded more, many more. Multiple skeletal remains, jumbled yet still discernible, lay tangled within the freshly turned soil. The scope of the horror expanded exponentially, a dark stain spreading across the quiet landscape. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the meticulous precision of the first discovery with the more chaotic arrangement of these new subjects. Was it a different hand? Or had the methodology simply evolved, or devolved, over time? We need to secure this entire area, I told the officer overseeing the excavation, my voice tight. And we need to move these subjects with extreme care. Every fragment matters. The logistical challenge was immense, but the urgency outweighed any inconvenience. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, unsettling shadows across the exposed grave. I knew we couldn't leave them here overnight. The air here was dry, cool, and carried the faint, clinical scent of disinfectant. Rows of stainless steel tables, usually reserved for anatomical study, now held the grim cargo from the construction site. My team, a dedicated group of forensic anthropologists and assistants, moved with quiet efficiency, carefully unbagging and laying out the skeletal elements. I stood over the first table, examining a skull under the bright overhead lights. The bone was discolored, pitted by decades of burial, but the telltale signs of perimortem trauma were still starkly visible. My fingers traced the edges of the injury, a shiver running down my spine. This was not random violence. This was deliberate, patterned. Dr. Chen, one of my assistants, called out, her voice hushed, "We have something here." I moved to her table. She pointed to a partially articulated spine. "Look at the lumbar vertebrae, specifically L3 and L4. There's significant compression and an unusual fusion here, indicative of a severe, unhealed fracture that eventually calcified, likely from a fall or major impact in adolescence." I leaned closer, my gaze fixed on the anomaly. It was distinct, a jagged, almost unnatural curve where the bones should have been smoothly aligned. An old injury, certainly, one that would have caused chronic pain and a noticeable gait. Something clicked in my memory, a faint echo from the historical archives I'd been poring over in the initial days of this investigation. I'd been looking for missing persons, for patterns, for anything that might link to the initial grave. But this felt different. "Keep processing," I instructed, my voice firm. "Document every detail. I need to cross-reference something." I retreated to a small, isolated office within the facility, a temporary space set up for me amidst the stacks of anatomical models and medical texts. My laptop hummed to life, its screen a portal back to dusty newspaper clippings and digitized police reports. I typed a specific query, focusing on local disappearances from the period I estimated these remains belonged to, mid-20th century, perhaps earlier. I filtered for physical descriptions, for any mention of unique injuries or conditions. The search results were a deluge, but one article, yellowed and faded even on screen, jumped out at me. A small piece from a local paper, dated 1957. "Local youth vanishes without a trace." The accompanying description mentioned a young man, 18 years old, known for a distinctive limp caused by a severe back injury sustained in a childhood accident. The article even detailed the incident, a fall from a construction scaffolding. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull thud against the quiet of the room. The name, though common, was attached to a specific address, a family known to have worked for one of the city's powerful founding families. The article went on to describe the initial, perfunctory search, the quick dismissal by local authorities, and the family's quiet, desperate pleas for help. This was it. A direct link. A specific, identifiable individual, and a disappearance that had been swept under the rug. The founding family's angle, which had felt like a distant, abstract possibility, suddenly solidified into a tangible threat. Someone had gone missing, someone connected, and their disappearance had been actively downplayed, ignored. I returned to the main analysis room, the energy in my steps renewed with a grim purpose. Her eyes met mine, a question in their depths. "Detective," I began, my voice clear and unwavering. "I believe we have a preliminary identification for one of our subjects. His name was... and he had a very specific, unhealed spinal injury from a childhood accident. We found it on one of the lumbar vertebrae." The detective's expression remained neutral, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, perhaps a dawning understanding of the implications. 1957? That's a long time ago, Dr. Chen. And a specific injury? Yes, I confirmed, pulling up the digital article on a tablet. The report mentions a fall from scaffolding. The family lived on the outskirts of the Caldwell estate at the time. The disappearance was quickly dismissed, despite the family's protests. The Caldwells. One of the city's oldest, wealthiest, and most influential founding families. The detective's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Caldwells, she repeated, the name heavy with unspoken history. That's a deep well, doctor, a very deep well. The bones don't lie, detective, I countered, my gaze unwavering. And the patterns of trauma on these remains are consistent with the initial discovery. This is a pattern of disappearances, systematically covered up, and it leads directly back to the heart of this city's history. We have to follow it. The tension in the room thickened, palpable. The bones had spoken, and their story was far more intricate, and far more dangerous, than I had ever anticipated. We weren't just digging up the dead, we were unearthing secrets that powerful, living people had fought hard to keep buried. My breath plumed visible in the frigid air as I leaned closer to the examination table, the harsh, white light of the surgical lamp illuminating the latest set of remains. My team, 2 dedicated colleagues, worked methodically at adjacent stations. One, a quiet osteologist, meticulously cleaned fragments of bone with specialized brushes, while another, a bioarchaeologist, carefully catalogued every piece, no matter how small. We were a quiet symphony of grim purpose, each movement precise, deliberate. The facility, usually reserved for anatomical studies, had been cleared for us, its rows of stainless steel gurneys now holding our grim puzzle pieces instead of educational specimens. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Raj," the osteologist murmured, her voice barely a whisper against the hum. "I'm finding consistent patterns here. Perimodum fractures, specifically around the occipital region, on 3 of the individuals from the lower strata. This distinct, almost symmetrical depression. The first few individuals we'd unearthed had shown very trauma, but the deeper we went, the more consistent the methods seemed. This wasn't random violence. This was execution. And this," the bioarchaeologist chimed in, holding up a small, corroded piece of metal with tweezers. "Found embedded near the C1 vertebra of the oldest individual. It's too small for a projectile, but look at the etching." I took the tweezers, bringing the object closer to my eye. Under the magnification, a faint, almost erased symbol became visible. It was a stylized G intertwined with a laurel wreath. Familiar, somehow. I felt a prickle of recognition, a phantom memory teasing at the edge of my consciousness. Where had I seen that before? It's a uniform button, or perhaps a clasp, I mused, turning it over. Heavy brass, despite the corrosion. This isn't mass-produced, not from any standard military or police uniform I know. The osteologist frowned. The trauma, Raj. It's too precise. And the consistent impact site. It suggests a trained hand, or at least a repeated, deliberate action. Almost ritualistic, as you said. Ritualistic. The word hung in the cold air. Not just a method of killing, but a method of control, and that symbol. I walked over to a nearby workstation, where printouts of historical city records and architectural blueprints were spread out. My gaze drifted over old photographs of city founders, their stern faces frozen in time. Then it clicked. The gilding family crest, I breathed, pointing to an old photograph of a grand, stone edifice, the original gilding estate, now a sprawling corporate campus. On the building's facade, etched into the stone above the main entrance, was the exact same stylized G with the laurel wreath. It was their private security emblem. From the early 20th century. My grandfather had an old book on city heraldry. I remember seeing it there. A silence descended, heavier than the hum of the ventilation. The Dildings. One of the city's oldest and most powerful founding families. Their name was synonymous with wealth, influence, and philanthropy. By people with power, people who could erase them completely. My mind reeled. A specific, identifiable trauma pattern, linked to a powerful family's security force, a uniform emblem. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The stakes had just escalated dramatically. We weren't just dealing with forgotten victims, we were now staring directly into the face of living power, power that had remained undisturbed for decades. Just as the implications fully settled, my phone buzzed, vibrating against the stainless steel table. It was an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, my gloved hand hovering over the screen. I knew, instinctively, that this call was not a coincidence. This was the pushback. I answered. Raj Chen. A smooth, cultured voice, unfamiliar yet subtly authoritative, spoke on the other end. Dr. Chen. My apologies for the intrusion. My name is Roll E.G., the city's chief legal counsel. I understand your team has made some interesting discoveries at the excavation site. Perhaps we could discuss this further. Discreetly. My office, tomorrow morning. 8 sharp. The word discreetly hung in the air, a veiled threat. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. The tension in the room, already thick, now felt suffocating. They knew. They had been watching. The bones had indeed spoken, and the living had heard. And now, they were coming for us. I looked down at the corroded brass button, the stylized G staring back at me, a silent challenge. It was also, I discovered, a place where the living could feel unervingly exposed. The air, perpetually chilled to a precise 4 degrees Celsius, carried the faint, metallic tang of preservation chemicals, a scent I'd grown accustomed to, almost oblivious to, until now. The previous night's veiled threat had sharpened my senses, making every creak of the ventilation system, every distant hum of machinery, a potential harbinger. My colleagues, bless their focused souls, were deep in their work, oblivious to the undercurrent of dread that had been steadily tightening its grip on me. One of my junior researchers meticulously photographed a fractured clavicle, its edges still bearing the distinct marks of blunt force trauma. Another colleague, their face illuminated by the bright task lamp, carefully measured the length of a femur, cross-referencing it with the growth plates we'd already analyzed. I stood by a large analytical table, a stack of preliminary reports clutched in my hand, reviewing the latest radiocarbon dating results. The timeline was solidifying, pushing some of the remains further back than initially estimated, into the late 1960s and early 70s. The implications were staggering, reaching back through generations, intertwining with the city's foundational myths. A sudden, sharp rap on the heavy metal door made me flinch, the papers rustling in my grip. My colleagues looked up, startled by the sound's abruptness in the otherwise hushed facility. We rarely had unscheduled visitors. Security protocols here were stringent, designed to protect the integrity of both our research and the dignity of the deceased. The door, heavy and insulated, swung inward with a slow, deliberate creak, revealing a figure silhouetted against the fluorescent light of the corridor. He was a man of imposing stature, dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed too formal for the sterile environment. His silver hair was meticulously combed, and his face, etched with lines of authority, held an expression of unwavering purpose. His eyes, the color of gunmetal, swept over us, lingering for a fraction too long on the skeletal fragments laid out on our tables. He wasn't a university official, I knew every one of them. This man radiated a different kind of power, one that bypassed academic hierarchy entirely. Dr. Raj Chen, he stated, his voice a low rumble that resonated in the cold air. It wasn't a question. A word, if you please. My colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. The junior researcher instinctively moved to shield the clavicle with their body, a silent, defiant gesture. I felt a surge of protectiveness for them, and for the work we were doing. This man was here because of the bones. Chen is implicit. My principals have a vested interest in your discoveries. He took a step inside, the door slowly closing behind him, severing us from the outside world. The click of the latch echoed unnervingly. Specifically, they are concerned about the narratives emerging from your current excavation. They believe certain historical interpretations might be disruptive. Our work is purely scientific, I countered, crossing my arms. We interpret facts, not narratives. Indeed, he conceded, taking another slow step, his gaze drifting to the analytical table where the skeletal remains lay. And facts, Dr. Chen, can be inconvenient. Especially when they contradict established truths, truths that have served the city well for generations. His eyes fixed on me again, unblinking. The families who built this city, who shaped its institutions, value discretion. They prefer their legacies untarnished. Are you threatening me? The words were out before I could fully process them, raw and challenging. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. A threat? No, Dr. Chen. Think of it as a friendly advisory. A plea for prudence. Your unique talents are highly valued, and it would be a shame to see them misdirected. There are other fascinating mysteries, perhaps less politically charged, that could benefit from your expertise. He paused, letting his words hang in the frigid air. The university, I assure you, has many ways of reallocating resources, especially for projects that become problematic. My stomach tightened. He wasn't just threatening me, he was threatening my career, my funding, my ability to continue this work. He was threatening my team. I stated, pushing back, deliberately giving him more information than he wanted, watching for a reaction. The number of individuals. The methodical nature of their disposal, the consistent age range. This isn't random. This speaks to a system. His expression remained impassive, but a flicker in his eyes, a subtle tightening around his jaw, confirmed my suspicion. He knew. He knew exactly what I was talking about. But systems have many components, Doctor. Some are robust, others less so. It would be a tragedy if, in your pursuit of systemic truth, you were to damage an irreplaceable component. He glanced pointedly at my team, then back at me. Or, indeed, if an irreplaceable component of your own project were to suffer an unfortunate accident. Research funding, laboratory access, even personal safety can be surprisingly fragile. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken menace. He wasn't just talking about my career anymore. He was talking about lives. He was talking about our lives. The city's powerful families weren't just influential, they were ruthless. Quietly. And then move on, he said, his gaze unwavering. We are prepared to be generous in facilitating your transition to a less contentious field of study. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulling out a small, heavy envelope. He placed it on the nearest analytical table, beside a tray of meticulously labeled bone fragments. It was thick, undoubtedly filled with cash. A bribe. I looked at the envelope, then at the skeletal remains, then back at the man. The bones represented lives extinguished, justice denied. Accepting that envelope would be burying them again, deeper this time, with my own hands. That won't be happening, I stated, pushing the envelope away with a single, firm finger. It slid across the stainless steel, coming to rest against the cold metal edge. These individuals deserve their stories told. And I intend to tell them. The man's impassive facade finally cracked, a flash of genuine anger in his gunmetal eyes. You underestimate the reach of those you oppose, Doctor, and you overestimate your own position. He turned, his movements fluid despite his size, and walked towards the door. Consider this your final warning. The consequences of your continued obstinacy will be severe. My colleagues stared at me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a fear that mirrored my own. He hadn't mentioned names, but his words had painted a clear picture. The families weren't just founding families, they were the architects of a long-standing criminal enterprise, protected by layers of influence and intimidation. And they had just shown us how far they were willing to go. And now, they were not just coming for us, they were here. We were no longer just scientists, we were targets. My colleagues stared, a tableau of frozen apprehension. The door to the corridor, now a sealed barrier, seemed to hum with the absence of the detective. But the air around us had grown denser, charged with an unspoken understanding. We had been warned, subtly, overtly, by the visit itself, by the quiet menace that had just walked away. Raj, asked the junior forensic technician, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the closed door. I felt the tremor in my own hands, but pushed it down. Fear was a luxury I couldn't afford, not when the dead were clamoring for justice. Now we make ours. I turned back to the workstation, its stainless steel surface gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Spread across it were microsamples, bone fragments, and a series of slides, all meticulously catalogued. For days, a particular residue had gnawed at me. It was microscopic, clinging to the perimortem fractures of the latest set of unearthed remains, the ones that had initiated this entire excavation. It wasn't soil, wasn't organic, and didn't match any known environmental contaminant from the burial site. It was something synthetic, almost crystalline in its structure. Let's go back to the polymer trace on subject 37, I instructed, pulling up the digital microscope's feed on the monitor. I need a fresh spectral analysis, cross-referenced against the proprietary materials database. The senior forensic analyst, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a razor-sharp intellect, moved to the mass spectrometer. Her hands were precise, practiced. The junior technician began preparing a new slide, her earlier fear now channeled into methodical action. I watched the screen, a swirling kaleidoscope of molecular data, each peak and valley a silent testament to the material's composition. my determination hardened, a steel rod in my spine. They hadn't met Chen. There, the senior analyst's voice cut through the stillness, a note of controlled excitement in her tone. A match. Or, rather, a near-perfect match. It's a specialized polymer composite. Extremely high tensile strength, unique thermal resistance. Used primarily in advanced structural applications. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the data. Advanced structural applications, I repeated, the words resonating with the architect theme that had haunted me. Proprietary? Exclusively, she confirmed, adjusting her glasses. Registered to Ethelred Holdings Incorporated. They're the sole manufacturer globally. Ethelred Holdings. The name hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was one of the city's oldest and most powerful corporations, a name synonymous with its skyline, its infrastructure, its very foundation. They built the bridges, the towers, the sprawling residential complexes. And they were owned, lock, stock, and barrel, by the Thorne family, one of the original founding families. My gaze snapped to the senior analyst. Cross-referenced the patent holder with the historical records of the Thorne family. Specifically, look for individuals with a background in advanced materials engineering or structural design. A few tense moments passed, the junior technician now watching the screens with wide, unblinking eyes. The senior analyst typed furiously, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Then, a name flashed on the screen, highlighted in bold. The current patriarch. Graduated top of his class in structural engineering from the city's Institute of Technology, decades ago. Patented this exact polymer composite system shortly after inheriting Ethelred Holdings. Known for his meticulous attention to detail, his architectural vision for the city. Elias Thorne. The esteemed civic leader, the philanthropic titan, the man whose face graced the society pages. He was literally an architect. The specific, almost ritualistic nature of the burials, the precise perimortem trauma, it all clicked into place. This wasn't random violence, it was meticulously planned, executed with an engineer's precision. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a key figure, this was the apex. The architect. The mastermind. The weight of the discovery was crushing, a physical burden on my shoulders. We had cracked it. But with that revelation came a terrifying realization: we had just exposed the most powerful man in the city. The man who had just sent a detective to our door. We had the evidence. We had a name. And now, the hunt for the living would begin. My determination, once a quiet ember, now flared into a raging inferno. Elias Thorne. We were coming for him. Elias Thorne. The architect of silence. It wasn't just a cruel nickname anymore, it was a damning, literal truth. My mind raced, connecting the dots I hadn't dared to consider. Thorne, the civic leader, the philanthropist, the man whose company built half the city's modern infrastructure, including, I now realized with a sickening lurch, this very facility. I stood before the open, custom-built access panel hidden behind a row of stainless steel cadaver drawers. The air here, usually a faint blend of formaldehyde and antiseptic, now carried a metallic tang, almost like old blood. My gaze swept over the meticulously crafted steel frame, the heavy-duty bolts, the precision engineering. It was Thorne's signature, stark and undeniable. He built this wing, didn't he? I murmured, not really a question, more a confirmation to myself. His forensic technicians, moving with practiced efficiency, were already swarming the small, concealed space I'd discovered, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. His company won the bid for the entire medical school expansion 20 years ago. The detective confirmed, his voice low, almost reverent in the face of the revelation. State-of-the-art facility, they called it. High security, Climate controlled. Perfect for what he was doing. What he was doing. The thought made my stomach clench. It wasn't on any blueprints I'd ever seen. But it was the floor that held my attention. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration, a reddish-brown stain that had been meticulously scrubbed, yet still clung to the molecular structure of the polymer. The blood residue tests are going to be critical, I told the detective, pointing with a gloved hand. It's old, heavily degraded, but it's there. The polymer, designed for durability, showed faint, parallel scoring marks, consistent with heavy objects being dragged or perhaps suspended and then dropped. The spacing of the marks, the depth, they mirrored patterns I'd observed on some of the skeletal remains from the excavation site, the unique perimortem trauma consistent with restraint and a specific method of impact. These hooks, I continued, tracing one with my finger, they're robust. Too robust for medical equipment. And the height. They suggest a specific kind of suspension. The kind that would facilitate a controlled process, not just storage. A technician, a younger woman with focused intensity, carefully swabbed the stained area, sealing the samples in sterile vials. Another meticulously photographed every inch of the chamber. The air was thick with unspoken implications. This wasn't just a place of concealment, it was a stage. And then there's this, I added, rising and moving to a small, almost invisible seam in the polymer lining near the base of the wall. Inside, nestled in the dust and grime, was a single, tarnished silver locket. We had found fragments of a similar locket at one of the burial sites, a unique family heirloom described by her distant relatives, but never the locket itself. This was it, intact, unmistakable. The detective leaned in, his expression grim. He kept souvenirs, he stated, the words heavy with disgust. Or a trophy, I corrected. Held them, then took them to their final resting places. This chamber. It was his antechamber to oblivion. The locket was the undeniable final piece. It linked the ritualistic burials, the missing persons, the specific trauma patterns, directly to this hidden chamber, and by extension, to Elias Thorne, the man who designed and built the very structure containing it. He looked at me, a flicker of respect in his tired eyes. More than enough, Raj. This puts him here. This puts him at the center of it all. The weight of decades of unanswered questions, of families haunted by disappearances, was about to be lifted. Elias Thorne, the untouchable, was about to face the justice he had so cunningly evaded. The silence that followed my realization was not empty. It thrummed with the weight of impending justice, a quiet before the storm that would finally break over Elias Thorne. My phone vibrated in my hand, a message from the lead detective confirming their position. They were moving in. Around me, the evidence lay meticulously arranged. Not just photographs and reports, but the very bones themselves, cleaned, articulated, and tagged, each telling a silent, undeniable story. The heavy door creaked open, and the lead detective entered, his face grim but resolute. Behind him came the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman known for her relentless pursuit of truth, and two uniformed officers. They didn't need to speak. The air crackled with shared purpose. He's been apprehended, the lead detective stated, his voice low, almost reverent. At his estate. Didn't resist. Too stunned, I think. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped me. Stunned. Yes, I could imagine. Elias Thorne, the man who had woven a tapestry of power and deceit for generations, finally caught in a web of his own making, spun from the very earth he thought he controlled. Good, I managed, my voice a little rough. Now, we ensure his conviction. Every single victim deserves that. I gestured to the rows of skeletal remains, each draped with a light sheet, awaiting their final identification and return. We've confirmed the identities of the remaining 3 individuals from the shallow graves. Evelyn Reed, missing since 1978. Thomas Miller, 1982. And Sarah Jenkins, 1985. I walked them through the evidence, my voice steady, professional, yet imbued with the profound weight of my findings. The perimortem trauma patterns are consistent across all remains, including those we identified earlier. Blunt force trauma to the cranium, followed by a specific, almost surgical, disarticulation of the cervical vertebrae. The methodology points to a practiced hand, a ritualistic approach to silencing dissent within their ranks. I pointed to magnified images projected onto a screen, subtle striations on a rib, a unique fracture pattern on an ulna. These tell us not just how they died, but why. These were not random acts. These were executions, carried out to maintain the Thorne family's grip on the city's resources, particularly the land deals and the silencing of anyone who threatened to expose their illegal activities. The prosecutor leaned in, her gaze sharp, absorbing every detail. The motive is clear. The means, horrific. And the opportunity, provided by decades of unchecked power. But the ritualistic aspect. That's key. It shows premeditation, organization. A conspiracy. Precisely, I affirmed. The founding families weren't just powerful, they were a cabal. Elias Thorne merely inherited the mantle, and continued the gruesome tradition. The patterns of burial, the specific locations chosen, all meant to obscure, to make the earth swallow their secrets whole. But the earth, as always, eventually speaks. I led them to a specific set of remains, laid out on a stainless steel table. This is the final piece. The bones of Samuel Thorne, Elias's own uncle, who disappeared in 1975. We found him buried deeper, beneath the others. His injuries matched the pattern, but there's an additional detail, a unique dental filling, confirmed by his dental records. Samuel was the first, the blueprint. Elias, then a young man, was involved, learning at his father's knee. The prosecutor's eyes widened slightly. So, he wasn't just continuing a legacy, he was complicit from the very beginning. An active participant in the initial cover-up. Yes, I confirmed, a bitter taste in my mouth. The subsequent victims were those who later stumbled upon the truth, or threatened the ongoing operations. The specific method of killing, the burial ritual, it was a family tradition, passed down, a twisted rite of passage for those initiated into the core secret. The lead detective nodded slowly. This is it, Raj. This is the case. We have everything we need to ensure he never sees the light of day again. A profound sense of exhaustion washed over me, but it was accompanied by a quiet triumph. The bones, these silent witnesses, had finally screamed their truth. The families, who had lived with the agonizing uncertainty of their loved ones' disappearances, would finally have answers, however grim. I walked among the tables, touching a cleaned femur here, a reconstructed skull there. Each bone represented a life, a story, a family torn apart. I thought of the construction workers who had unearthed the first grave, unknowingly cracking open a decades-old conspiracy. I thought of the initial fear, the painstaking work, the frustrating dead ends, and the relentless pursuit of truth that had led us here. The closure wasn't just for the victims' families, it was for me too. The relentless pressure, the constant immersion in death, had taken its toll. But seeing justice finally within reach, knowing that I had been instrumental in giving these forgotten souls their voice, brought a unique kind of peace. My work was done, for now.